Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.
Hello, Avaya family. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of Avaya University. Avaya is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you so much for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Susan Anderson, is with us today to talk about healing the underlying primal wound of abandonment. Susan is an author and expert on how to overcome abandonment and its aftermath of self-sabotaging patterns. She reaches out through her websites, workshops, and media to share her methods of abandonment recovery with victims of the trauma of abandonment, heartbreak, and loss around the world. And her groundbreaking program is the product of over 30 years of research and clinical practice. Welcome to Avaya, Susan.
Well, thank you for having me, Andy.
Absolutely. So excited to have you here. And why don't we dive into obviously this topic of abandonment today? So what do you think abandonment encompasses?
Well, abandonment encompasses the feeling that life itself has left you on a doorstep, which is a very natural feeling that we may encounter through many triggers. But it's someone going through a heartbreak, someone going through divorce, a loss. It's losing a job, losing your sense of purpose. It's maybe having one of your children be angry with you and you feel misunderstood. It's being alone and not being able to find a relationship. It's being stuck in patterns of self-sabotage. It's a feeling of vulnerability that may just be sort of a vague feeling or a feeling of insecurity in relationships that sabotages your relationships. It's many things depending on your life circumstance.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you for that comprehensive overview of what that might look like for people. So let's talk about stages of abandonment, since I know that's something that you talk about in your work. Could you go through those stages with us?
Yeah, SWIRL, they spell SWIRL. It's an acronym that stands for shattering, withdrawal, internalizing, rage, and lifting. And the first, when you feel an adult trigger, let's just say a breakup, that's a fairly typical trigger that makes us very emotionally, upset and disarranged. The first stage is when you feel shattered. It feels that your life is over. You're demoralized by it. Everything that you thought would happen isn't happening. You question yourself. You are shattered. It's as if you are a pane of glass and you've been thrown to the ground and you're fragmented all over the place. You're just shattered. And then the next phase is withdrawal. So that first you're shattered and then you start to realize that you want the thing that's missing. Maybe it's the person who broke up with you, or it's the job that you lost, or it's the friend who moved away. But you start yearning for that yearning for the object. So you're searching and seeking, your brain is doing this on its own for that connection that it can't find. And you go into withdrawal as if you're in heroin withdrawal, except instead of craving the drug, you're craving the connection with that person. And it's an awful feeling of pining and longing. And then the next phase is internalizing, where you are beating yourself up. You're taking the anger over being rejected against yourself and causing yourself to get very depressed. And you start to doubt yourself. It's my fault. I'm not worthy. I'm not special enough. I'm not valuable enough. No, I'm not worth keeping. All of this self-doubt and these shame feelings come in. And during the internalizing phase is when the wound of abandonment can get infected, because it can damage your self-esteem and it can create some permanent scarring. And all of us have been a little scarred by previous abandonments from childhood all the way out. We're all kind of banged up by the different times that we've been through this. And then the fourth phase is rage. And that's when, you've been blaming yourself and beating yourself up and doubting yourself, but now you're saying, wait a minute, this isn't all my fault, and what about you? And so there's rage. So there's frustration, and it's kind of an agitated depression. And a lot of times, if you're an abandonment survivor who's had childhood issues with, insecurity in childhood with your parents or something, when you're in rage, you're afraid to express the rage directly to the abandoner because you don't want to lose a crumb of love. But you get very enraged at your friends who say things like, just let go and move forward. They don't understand. So you can displace the rage, that agitation that you feel. You can displace it onto people who are trying to help. And it's true that people don't really, they are not in your shoes, so they think it's easier to deal with than it really is. This stuff is very hard to deal with. And then the final phase is lifting. And you lift out of the abandonment. The intervals of lifting can increase as you go through this process. At first, you lift for 2 minutes because a friend made you laugh. And then after a while, a whole hour, you've been in so much pain over the abandonment, but a whole hour goes by where you're just kind of relaxing and reading a book or having a nice walk in your garden or something. So lifting can occur, but when you lift, if you don't know how to handle the feelings, you can lift and your feelings will not be intact. You'll be numb. You will not bring your feelings with you if you don't know how to handle them. And so abandonment can create a diminishment, and it can create sort of scar tissue and numbing in your emotional system. And if that happens, a very common pattern is you'll start being attracted only to unavailable people, because that you can feel, but just normal love, you're too numb to feel mutual love. So you need to keep chasing unavailable people. It's a very common pattern that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 5 phases, and you swirl through them with their overlapping phases. You swirl through them within an hour, within a week, within a month, within a year. They're cycles within cycles. You swirl through them over and over again until you come out of the end of the funnel a changed person, hopefully changed for the better.
Right. Gotcha. Thank you so much for going through those, and also that reminding us that it's not necessarily linear and that you can go in and out of those cycles. So how long on average does this take people to go through? And also, can people get stuck in like one particular stage of abandonment?
Well, there's no normal length of time. If you are stuck in an abandonment that you could have had a very significant relationship, let's say, and it was 5 years ago, and you could still be struggling with a lot of the feelings. And what was the second part of your question? The getting stuck in one stage more than the other?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I think you already answered it, that there's no like timeline that most people follow or whatever. I was right. Like, how long does it take to ultimately get over it?
It's all normal, because the part of our personalities that are affected are something beyond our control. It's very involuntary. There's a lot we can do to help ourselves, but if we don't know those tools, it just sort of takes on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. And as far as, depending on your childhood or the nature of your relationship, you could get stuck in shattering and wind up in unstable. If you had a very shattering childhood, or if you had a lot of shattering experiences, you could wind up with an instability pattern. Or if your parents were cold and rejecting or critical, you could wind up internalizing a lot and have a self-esteem issue. And that could be the stage that you get stuck in the most. It depends on, what took place before it and what kind of vulnerabilities you have. That will dictate which one of those phases gives you the most trouble.
Right. Gotcha. So, when I was reading in the beginning your bio, it talked about, right, self-sabotaging patterns that come in the aftermath of abandonment. What can you share a little bit about what those are?
Yes. So the way abandonment has its lingering impact isn't just that it's pain, it also leads to ongoing feelings of insecurity and all kinds of discomfort and the need to reconnect with a new person, all different things. And that arouses the need to have quick fixes and immediate gratification because of all the discomfort that comes out of it. So from childhood on, the abandonment experiences that we have lead to, defense mechanisms and quick fixes. So that those become patterns of self-sabotage because it's not the adult cognitive mind that chose this thing. It's because it's habit that we've developed in order to make ourselves feel better. So the aftermath of unresolved abandonment from childhood, adolescence, adulthood is their patterns of self-sabotage. I call that the outer child. The outer child is the part of the personality that starts creating habits, defense mechanisms. But when you get to be an adult, those defense mechanisms become maladaptive because they wind up tripping you up
Gotcha.
in adulthood.
Gotcha. The outer child. Got it. Okay. Yeah, that I definitely can relate to so many different patterns that develop over the years in the aftermath of abandonment. So I'm glad that you talked about that and how that forms. So so how, I guess, for people watching right now, right, they're coming to this because they have had an abandonment or maybe multiple abandonments and they're really struggling with that, as well as low self-worth. So how can they start getting over this pain, this loss in their lives?
Well, it's an enormous step to recognize that you have, we don't just deal with the current trigger. There's an underlying primal abandonment wound. It consists of primal abandonment, fear, and shame. And we all have it. It's human. It's the crux of the human condition. And it's an enormous step in the right direction to realize that we all have this and that you're human, that you have it too, and kind of tune into it. And then once you realize that you're dealing with a very deep core part of yourself, there's so much you can do. You don't think your way out of it, you do your way out of it. There are tools and exercises that really help to take these emotions, these primal feelings, and turn them into, positive behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love.
And that's the abandonment recovery program.
Gotcha. So like if someone is in the thick of, in my experience, abandonment, like when I go into my past, abandonment can be such a scary thing, or the thoughts, right? Catastrophizing of the future of like, oh, I don't want to be abandoned. What if someone abandons me? When someone is in that very fearful state of mind, whether they're being abandoned in the moment or not, like any thoughts on something they can apply from your work in those moments of fear?
Well, a very common phenomenon for people is that when they start to get into a new relationship, they feel so vulnerable because especially if they like the person, if they like the person and want the relationship, the vulnerability of the potential for being abandoned, rejected is so great that it creates all kinds of anxiety. And the other person becomes all important and everything that they do, every little gesture is, what does this mean? This is very universal. Even those of us who are very cool and don't show this kind of insecurity on the outside, getting into a new relationship is an insecure, scary thing for anybody. We're all vulnerable. But there is something we can do, which is that the person who's responsible for making you secure is not the other person, but it is you yourself. So when you realize that only you can be responsible for yourself emotionally, only you can make yourself really feel secure, that the other person could help, but it's your responsibility. Once you realize that, then you take care of you first. And there, of course, this is not by osmosis. There are exercises that you can do to make sure that you are putting your own abandoned inner child first.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the most important relationship of all the other relationships, is the relationship that you have with yourself. And the best time to work on that is when you're feeling insecure or abandoned, because that's when you really need to give yourself that love and acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so glad you just said all of that, because isn't that the truth in the world of so many of us, I think, want that other person to fill that right hole, and it's not going to happen. It always comes back to us, right?
And it can sneak up on us. We can all of a sudden realize we're being focused on the other person, that other people have too much power in our lives. We're dependent on how they feel about us, and we can catch ourselves and say, oh, I've slipped into that again. I must now regroup and make that connection with my own inner child, and use an exercise that helps you do that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you for going through that. And next question I want to ask you is about something you call a bandaholic. What makes someone an abandaholic, and what does that mean?
Well, an abandaholic technically means you're addicted to abandahol. You're addicted to abandonment. And it isn't quite like that, but that's kind of where the phrase comes from. It's that you are only attracted to the unavailable because you've been conditioned to equate love with insecurity. Previous experiences have caused you to associate being insecure over someone with being attracted to them. So now suddenly you have a pattern in adulthood where unless you're feeling insecure, you're not attracted. And in fact, this is something that happens to millions of people, millions. And that's why many millions of people are alone, because this obviously would not work to have a relationship. But when somebody you've been pursuing and they're hard to get at first, but pretty soon they become interested and they start to meet you halfway, then if you're an abandaholic, you lose interest. And it happens all the time. It is very, very common. And the person who is at the other end of that feels abandoned, but you feel terrible because you're not able to sustain your love feelings toward the other person. You're on the verge of having a mutual connection because now they like you too and they're showing up, but you can't feel it any longer. You've lost the interest. This dilemma of losing your feelings for someone who's available, it is millions and millions of people have that. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of chasing the unavailable, being attracted only to the unavailable, and then losing interest and pulling away when the other person is available is abandaholism and very prevalent.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you for going into that. So if someone is recognizing that is something they struggle with in this moment, any tips on what to do about that or get started healing that and working through it?
Well, one tip is that don't expect it to go easy. This is a very, very deeply set pattern. It's part of conditioning. You literally have become conditioned to equate insecurity with attraction. And so it's a matter of really being patient with yourself and accepting yourself, and then working with tools, power tools that really work with the mechanism that governs these things. There's an internal mechanism that sort of, it's the mechanism of conditioning really, but it's an internal mechanism. And in order to work with it, you can't just think your way out of it. You have to actually practice things that have a very dynamic impact. And that has to do with creating various written dialogues and trialogues and, various techniques like that. Also using your imagination in a very guided way. But with those tools, you can change this. It just don't expect it to go easily. it's going to be bumpy at the beginning. But if you're determined, you'll get out of it.
Yeah, it reminds me of people telling me in the past that they're only attracted to the bad boys or the bad girls, or
Yes, that's kind of the same thing. Yes.
Yeah.
And again, if the person has to be a little on the shady side, they need to be a little into drugs or something like that in order to keep your interest. It's conditioning. If somebody has that pattern, it's not really their fault. They got attracted to a bad guy, and now they were conditioned to equate the love, the wiring in the brain was conditioned to be attracted to danger, to somebody who's a little unsafe. So it's an automatic thing, but they can undo that with effort.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you. What about being love challenged? That's something else you talk about in your work. What does it mean when you say that some people are love challenged?
Well, again, we're talking about, the reason that we need to coin these phrases is because these things are so prevalent, and they're not really talked about very much, because if you're someone who's love challenged, it's kind of hard to admit that to yourself, to be able to say, oh, by the way, I have difficulty loving. It's very hard to self-diagnose. I'm thinking of someone I worked with who was love challenged, but he didn't know it because he had been madly in love with other people in his life. He would have climbed Mount Everest for them. The only problem was they were hard to get. So he was only able to feel love when he was challenged, when the person was an emotional challenge. But when it came to having a real relationship, right, very down to earth connection with someone, he didn't know how to conduct himself. He didn't know how to care. He didn't know how to create interest. Suddenly, conversation became boring with that person. Time stood still. Being with that person, the company felt boring. He didn't know how to engage in the creative process of love. And love is a creative process. So there are people who need extra help, and it begins with they're being able to, identify it in themselves, to self-diagnose.
I love what you just said, to engage in the creative process of love. That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, different way of looking at it. That is so interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about healing. So for Avaya students watching right now, struggling with this abandonment wound, what would you say, and you may have already kind of covered this a little bit, but what are the steps to emotional as well as spiritual healing?
Well, one very important thing is to recognize that it's a journey. It's not, abandonment isn't a boil and then there's pus and you relieve the pus and you solve it. It's not like based on the Freudian psychotherapy idea that you have a catharsis and get rid of it. You don't get rid of abandonment. It's very primal. The shame and the abandonment fear are primal. We have to learn how to work with them. So the tools are very, very substantial tools, but they involve a lot of work. Learning how to get into the moment by using your sensory organs to help you tune in a very deliberate way, getting into the moment as often as you can during the day. Learning how to use your imagination to create positive mental images. The ability to do that actually has an impact on the brain. It allows you to picture a future that is positive, and you can picture yourself doing things in the future that are good. And that helps you to rehearse doing those things. So you're really doing physical therapy for the brain. You're training your brain. But it doesn't happen by osmosis. You can't read about it in a book and think that it happened. You have to actually practice the exercise. Then we have identifying the abandoned inner child and creating a real intense relationship with that child, adopting that child and really creating a relationship. Then we have identifying the outer child and creating a 3-part framework, which is the inner child, the outer child, and the adult. And once you get that framework, it takes a little doing to really get it. But once you see that framework and those parts, you personify them, you have a real working model to change your life. And then there are exercises that you do, doing exercises, action plans to actually make that work. And then there is the idea of a future self. You know, we think of it as the higher self, but we're all aiming toward a future self. And so we picture ourselves in the future as we would like to be. It is a more robust version of our current self. It is a self that's more confident and bolder and more loving and caring. You know, it's the self that we want to be. And that future self, developing what that future self might be like and really visualizing it, is also a very important tool. And the tool, again, doesn't happen by osmosis. It involves writing and actually doing an exercise.
Mm-hmm. So we can't just put the book under our pillow at night and
No, but most people still try that. They think reading it or listening to it on tape and they'll get it, but
right.
They have to do it.
Right. The rewiring doesn't come from just the listening or the right.
No, it's not a cognitive process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very important. Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate you going through those steps, Susan. And since we're running low on time, I want to make sure that you talk about a program you have, as well as your books. And so there's links to your books, your website, and a discount to a program you have coming up, as well as an email address that people can contact you to learn more. So could you share about those things?
Well, all right. I have a bunch of books on abandonment recovery that guide you through step by step, that really explain it, as well as videotapes, etc. But I also have workshops. And abandonment recovery workshops, right now they're online, and they're very, very good online on Zoom. It actually works. The first one was an experiment, and it was very effective, and they're very helpful. So the workshop is excellent because people help people, and people share their situations, and the sharing is actually reducing the shame. So what happens is people's self-esteem increases as a result of taking the workshop. And then also in the workshop, they do the exercises. They don't just read about them, they're doing them. And they're doing them in front of other people, and they're sharing what it felt like. So it reinforces the exercises. So the doing of the exercises and the sharing and the information and insight, there are 5 sessions, really promotes a lot of growth.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And again, everyone, there's a bunch of links below that you can go access all of that on Susan's website. And do you have any last insights? Anything else that we've left out or you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Just that people don't have to achieve all of these gains perfectly. Sometimes in life, all we need to do is make a very small change, and that change makes the difference that makes the whole difference. Mm-hmm. So the work that you do you don't have to do every single thing perfectly and achieve all the different milestones. You know, in the workbook, it really gives you quizzes and milestones and so forth. But you don't have to achieve this perfectly. You can go about this the same way you go about most things, imperfectly. Mm-hmm. And just making a small improvement can make all the difference in a person's life.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That's very inspiring. Inspiring words to end on. Thank you so much for doing this, Susan.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've known about your work for years, and right, you are someone that comes to the top of the list when we talk about abandonment. So I'm so glad that we could have this conversation.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Thank you, everyone watching, Avaya students watching or listening right now, for showing up for yourself in these conversations, and we'll see you again real soon. Take care. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this last class with Susan Anderson. She talked with us about healing the underlying primal wound of abandonment. I absolutely loved this conversation. Susan is such an expert when it comes to this topic of abandonment and all of the different tools and tips and ways to heal from this wound. And I think some of the big take-home messages for me were that this primal wound of abandonment is something that we all struggle with, right? As human beings, we are designed to be with others, and that is like the essence of our survival, is to be with others. We can't be abandoned as a baby or we won't survive. So I think that's just it's an interesting thing to be present to, that no matter what you've gone through in your life, we all have this ultimate fear somewhere down in there about being abandoned, because it really does mean our survival. So interesting thoughts there. Also, I really enjoyed the conversation of how if we've had experiences of abandonment in our life, that can lead to being attracted to unavailable people, being attracted to the bad boys or the bad girls or what have you, or just unhealthy relationships. Because if we developed a wiring, right, in our brain that love is linked with insecurity, then of course we're going to go after these unavailable relationships, unavailable people. All those kinds of things have a lot of like maybe toxic relationship patterns, because we created that wire and we haven't broken that wire yet, right? We haven't reconnected it in a different way to something like love equals security, or love equals a creative process, or all of those different kinds of things. So I thought it was a really great way that she explained that. And then another really awesome thing was engaging in the creative process of love. I wrote that down because I thought that was just so intriguing, and recognizing that not all of us know how to engage in the creative process of love. But I wanted to mention that because it struck a chord with me, and it inspired me to learn more. Well, what does that even mean? What does it mean to engage in a creative process of love, whether that's with a partner or a friend or children or parents or whoever in your life or yourself, right? How can we all engage in a creative process of love? And then how can that look different for each of us, right? We all have creativity running through us. So what could that creative process of love be for you? Just something to explore in your journey today. So thank you, as always, for showing up for yourself, for being here with us at Avaya, and we will see you again soon. Take care.
Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.